bring in the sort of the parameters of GDPR, and then we'll follow on from that. So if you want to get Frank to give us the his most simplistic explanation of it and the parameters, etc.
We're now streaming live. Hello, you're very welcome. My name is John. I'm with Broadsheet, and this is the 14th in a series of shows looking at the Mother and Baby Home Commission of Investigation report. We're joined as ever by Tuam campaigner Breeda Murphy, adoptee and activist Eunan Duffy, and lawyer Frank Brehany, whose father was a Tuam adoptee. Good evening, Breeda, Eunan and Frank.
Hi there.
Good evening, John.
And we're going to go straight into Frank for the exciting GDPR segment of the show.
Yes, I mean, you know, let's get the dry as dust issue out of the way. But it isn't so dry as dust for many of the victims and survivors, because as we've seen, particularly since October last year, there is a very fluid interpretation of the GDPR. Curious, I will say. When I realized what was going on last October, I couldn't quite understand why government ministers and indeed people in the press were talking about data protection acts as opposed to the general data protection regulation. Now, because we live, well, certainly in the UK we used to live, but certainly we live in the same sphere as the European Union. But as the European Union has grown more together in terms of the operation of the single market and various other issues, it's become apparent that there was a number of disparate practices as far as data protection was concerned. And so the object of the European Union is to harmonise laws. And as part of that process, data was the key thing, particularly in the operation of business and particularly where consumers and their activities are concerned. But of course, it has much deeper rationale behind that. But that's essentially was the catalyst, if you like, to get the GDPR working. And so I think it was 2015, the general data protection rolled in to every member state, including the UK. And I will stress that under the various acts of parliament here in the UK, the GDPR has been carried over into UK law in its entirety for the present, I'll say. But there's one thing that many of your listeners may not understand, or viewers may not understand, is that when you talk about European regulation, it is not something that's abstract, that sits out there and it's just something that has happened. So, for example, if it was a directive, each member state would have to take that directive and implement the basics of that directive into its own law, and then to expand that directive up to the point that the directive allows. Where it involves a regulation, no parliament in the European Union has to do anything. Because we're all signatories to the European Union, we accept that regulations are automatically implemented into each member state. And the second point to remember about the GDPR, as indeed with all regulation, is that regulation or European law has supremacy over national laws. Now, there are deviances, there are judgments on the European Court of Justice on different issues. But if you take it as read that when the GDPR was introduced into the European Union, all countries, including Ireland, had to adopt the GDPR in its entirety into its legal system. And so therefore, if you like, you have domestic law that sits there, you have the GDPR law that sits there. So the Supreme Court of Ireland, when it comes to dealing with issues that involve data, will always look to the GDPR, and it will always look to the decisions of the European Court of Justice. And then it will adapt the other law on the other side or decisions on the other side according to the provisions there. Right. So you can see why last October I was puzzled to hear ministers and politicians in the Dáil whittering on about domestic data protection acts, when in fact the GDPR imports a much stronger set of rights for consumers. Consumers, I'm on my consumer head at the moment, but for all citizens, okay? There are two aspects to the GDPR. As I say, it's the protection of citizens, be they consumers or be they victims and survivors, company to company, business to business transactions, and so on and so forth. It guides the relationships between those whose data is captured and those who hold it, okay? And then the other aspect to the GDPR is, which domestic law failed to do over many years, or it did to a certain point, is that it didn't define the relationship or the structure of people who actually possessed the data, to people who handled it, to people who manipulated it, whatever. There's a whole food chain of people who are involved in the handling of data. Now, the GDPR gives substantial rights to those who are concerned about their data to access that data in very simple terms. But it also provides a number of caveats as well. You know, for example, if it's not in the public interest and stuff like that. But those, if you like, defenses to not giving you your data are, in my opinion, exceptions to the rule. I mean, you can see an argument perhaps be made in this kind of scenario, where if you have somebody who's trying to access data of their family history, but for example, a mother or father, birth mother or father says, no, I absolutely don't want my details being passed over, then the state is obligated to respond to that. But then there is a conflict between the substantial rights and wrongs of the victims and survivors measured against those who made their decision maybe 30, 40, even 50 years ago. And so therefore there is a question, in my view, of proportionality. It would be different, say, for example, if somebody, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago said, I do not want my child to find out who I am. But if you have somebody 30, 40, 50 years ago who made that decision under very different circumstances, then I don't think it's as easy, particularly as I've seen an awful lot of crocodile tears from politicians in the Dáil about this subject matter, you know, the sanctity of protecting that individual's decision 30, 40, 50 years ago against the present problem. And so you can see there is a disjunct, if you like, between the balancing of rights. So, you know, there is a sense that politicians are overbalancing the interests of one category of person over the interests of another. And my own personal view about that is that that kind of situation has to be mediated. It has to be adjudicated in the correct way. And, you know, to just simply provide, if you like, a blank canvas or a set response, if you like, to a very legitimate request to access those records without determining proportionality, without determining whether or not there is a public interest issue. And as we've talked about in previous weeks, this whole issue for victims and survivors is very much a public interest issue in the Irish Republic and indeed Northern Ireland. And there is a need, I think, for politicians to stop being so sacred about the GDPR. They need to understand that it has supremacy over anything that they've created in the Dáil in previous years. But they need to understand the proportional effects of that. They need to understand how to balance those rights against the potential to stop somebody getting to that information based on the GDPR. That is not what the GDPR was about. GDPR is about ease of access and transparency, and ensuring that people's data is being handled absolutely correctly, that person can actually go down the food chain and challenge those who are not handling their data correctly. But the important issue is on something as deeply personal as this and has a deep public interest. I do not think that the legal officers or indeed the politicians in the Oireachtas are actually looking at this in the correct way. Now you can theorize why that might be the case. I'm not really into conspiratorial sort of theories and stuff like that, but you can see why people could easily subscribe to that. I think it's much more basic, it's much more fundamental. It needs, if you like, a much cooler and, dare I say, a much more victim-led discussion on this issue of data. And above all, politicians, and I suggest the legal officers of government, need to actually educate themselves about the nature and the flow of European law and its supremacy.
Frank, may I ask you, in terms of the wishes of the mother, are they basing the politicians, as you say, are they basing it on the wishes of the mother from 30, 40, 50 years ago? Is that they're basing that on? Perhaps Breeda
in all of the debates that I've seen, actually watched live, in all of the reports that I've read from the Oireachtas, and indeed in the press commentary, that seems to be the central focus, yes.
But for instance, I mean, they may have been given those wishes under duress.
Well, indeed. I mean, just our own foray into the work we've been doing, the three of us have been doing the last couple of weeks, demonstrates very clearly, I think, one very important aspect of anybody's existence in society is whether or not they actually have agency. Agency over themselves, agency over their decisions. And if they don't have that, then, you know, you can bring into the mix the rationale of why they don't have agency, and it could be duress, it could be perhaps a lack of understanding, a lack of education, it could be the way that matters have been explained to them, it could be due to illegal processes.
Your grandmother, for instance, she was institutionalized now for 40 years. I mean, that she could be a possible candidate for that duress. I mean,
most certainly. It's something I've talked about with other campaigners because it's a complicated picture, but it's a mixture of an individual choosing a route to survival in an institutionalized way, or indeed becoming so indoctrinated, if you like, and having identity, having their own name taken away from them, having their clothes taken away from them, you know, having a diet which is not familiar to them, and all sorts of issues. There's so many different issues that contribute to the loss of oneself, the loss of personal identity, the loss of being. And if you are in that situation, you cannot be said to be exercising free will, or indeed being capable of making properly formulated decisions like you and I would. It's not that, that my grandmother, and indeed many thousands of women, didn't have capacity. On the contrary, they definitely had capacity, but such was the power of words, the power of actions, and the power of denial of the basic things that we take for granted, that produce this loss of agency. And of course, one of the biggest factors in my grandmother's life, just to demonstrate this point further, rather surprisingly, in relative short time span, by comparison to the 42 years she was incarcerated, she decided to become a consecrate. And there are several of us who've looked at this decision and looked at the situation she was in. And several of us have already concluded that she did not have agency.
Right.
The alternative to that is she made a conscious decision because she truly believed that she'd never get out of there, that she would find a method or a method of existence which would at least make her incarceration acceptable. Now that is probably the more kinder way to look at it, whereas I think the more realistic way to look at it is this particular agency point.
Yeah.
But as I say, it's not just about, you know, what happened to my grandmother. It's about the many, many thousands of women. And of course, then being branded, you know, in her situation, she was branded as Magdalene of Saint Isidore. And Saint Isidore was a Spanish academic and cleric. He was a bishop of Toledo, I think it was, in Spain in the Middle Ages. And he was an anti-Semite. And he ended up in his tenure in Spain all those hundreds of years ago, creating laws which separated children from their parents on the basis of religion. So, you know, it's the final insult, if you like, to a woman's existence that she would be given a consecrate name on the basis of some old anti-Semite bishop in the Middle Ages. You know, you can see the themes that run through all of these issues,
yeah.
and how, you know, whether it's people like Eunan or Breeda, or indeed me, second generation, third generations, and so on and so forth, are slowly peeling back, you know, these very important issues that cut to the heart of daily existence, but also cut to the heart of the present day, of how modern laws like the GDPR are being reinterpreted in modern day conditions rather than looking at the original decisions that were made. And it's a great place for politicians to live, because they can make a rather lofty claim that that they are protecting the rights of an individual. But you know, I think there's as much as some commentators claim that victims and survivors need to balance their rhetoric against different conditions and stuff like that, I say in reverse, you know what, guys, you need to balance your own rhetoric and actually think about what you're saying and think about the structure of how you approach such things as the GDPR.
Thank you for explaining GDPR and putting that into a lot of a way that I even understood. Thank you, Frank.
That's okay.
Breeda, in terms of when Frank has said that the politicians are basing all that on what the wishes were from 40, 50, you know, that could have changed, that could have been made under duress. What is your experience in terms of the? I know Eunan has your own personal experience in terms of success rate of reunions between children and the mothers.
I think, you see, it's very, very difficult to get information in the first instance. And when you talk about, you know, politicians having, are they actually looking at the privacy laws that, or privacy that might have been said by the woman at 40, 50 years ago, that, you know, I want my identity to be kept secret. That may have been said in some cases, and as Frank has explained brilliantly there, the lady did not have agency, nor did she have any choice. So it's all about choice, I think. And this came to the fore for me in the past week or so, where my relative, who is coming 88 years of age in May, did not know who he was, did not have any identity. And the birth cert he had, we found out last week, on Monday of last week, was actually false. It was, his name was false as recorded. And where he was placed in St. Kyron's Orphanage in Wicklow, that they only held records for 2 years of his life, from 1933 to 1935, although he was boarded out until 1949. Now, Frank again will be able to explain how this affects the future generations. And in David's case, it affects his children and his grandchildren, because lack of identity afforded to him affects them. And John O'Donoghue has written brilliantly on this, and it's about a sense of belonging and where you come from and where your people are. And the Irish have written about that for generations. And it's one of the things that hit me when I first did some study into this, was when I looked at England, where Frank has been, and now in Wales. The Irish went over in the 40s and 50s and rebuilt Britain. And one of the first questions you were asked on a building site, or when you came to the hospital to work as a domestic or train as a nurse, and you'd come from an Irish institution and you were maybe 18 years of age or 17, first question was, where are you from? And not being able to answer that, or trying to get away from that and trying not to reveal that you've come from an institution, was a heavy, heavy burden. So last week, after decades of trying, and after, for me, 18 months of trying with politicians, with TUSLA, with the Mercy archivist, with Wicklow County Council, with absolutely everybody who I thought could help, I was on Adoption Rights Alliance, because I'm a member there, and somebody called, a lovely lady called Mary Lawler, reflected that this gentleman may be able to help us. Now, I talked to David before and his daughter, and I felt I couldn't even go there again and say we may be able to get an answer. So I held out hope, but I thought we're going to meet with a blank wall. So a lot of the DNA data had been added, and that's how David initially found me. And in that, there were family trees developed throughout the United States, back to Ireland, into England, and certain connections, but nothing that could bring us to David's mother. So it transpired that she had been called under, her real name was Mary O'Donnell, and somehow along the line, I don't believe it was malicious, they called her Mary O'Connell, and that was, although it could be O'Donnell or O'Connell on the actual birth cert, and I tried under both headings, but we found, not alone did we find on Monday of last week David's mother, and find that David has 3 siblings, half siblings in the UK, but in Ireland, David has 3 half siblings here, and found his father as well. Both mother and father are deceased, but from the perspective, I suppose my perspective, being related and family, was that, and involved so much in this, and hearing of mass graves, and my God, visiting Tuam and being overcome at times, and going to the mass grave in the Magdalene Orme in Galway. My big fear was that either that she was buried in a mass grave, and that we may not be able to find her, but actually we found her, because she went on to have a family in the UK, and her grave is in Birmingham. So to say we're overcome with emotion is like, oh my God, this is why the government need to employ genealogists, when somebody's 88 years of age and doesn't know who they are. And while from the moment that David was on my DNA and quite closely related, I reached out. I asked them in the first instance, how were we related? And David's daughter, Josephine, came back to say, we don't know. Dad doesn't know any of his history. And I thought, well, he's ours. Tell Dad he's ours. Either way, we're not letting him go. So that was the first time that they'd kind of had that feeling of belonging. And we've talked obviously since, and David has been unwell. And our hope is that we can meet up, and the large extended family I come from are more than happy to meet him. But I suppose the sad part is that for so long, David did not have any of the information he was entitled to. The state did not help in any way. To be fair to Wicklow County Council, the archivist there was extremely helpful, because on the day I first contacted her to say, my relative is almost 87, or maybe he was turned 87 then, she dropped everything literally and began looking at records. And the archivist in Galway has also been helpful in that they tell me how to do things, how to research and find. But I will be forever, and our family will be forever grateful to a wonderful gentleman who would not take any fee, any monies for his work. And he has put in 5 days of working each day in order to try and decipher. And prior to that, you may know of Maurice Gleeson. Maurice Gleeson is the genealogist who works on adoption stories with Sharon Lawless, I believe is the name. And she does wonderful stories constantly on the TV, and does them brilliantly, I have to say. Well, Maurice had quoted me £60 sterling per hour. I didn't inform David and his family of that because I just couldn't. We had tried so hard, and I thought, how do you go to somebody who hasn't got an identity and tell them it may cost €1,000 to get some information, but we may not get anything of relevance? So again, as I say, the government, and who's behind all of the secrecy, that you've been saying to Frank, or why do the politicians use this card to say, oh, well, the mother may have said? I think it's because of those that work as bureaucrats within departments, because they have a lot of power and they hold on to information, and change is very difficult for governments. And I think they need to be realistic, because the information we got last week is the information coming down the track for many, many people. And people deserve better than we got. I mean, we were out on a limb, and it's so hard. I can't imagine how David lived for so long. Getting his PPS card, he had worked in this country for over 35 years, and yet when it came to getting his entitlements, because he didn't have his birth information, it was impossible.
Yeah, amazing. But incredible to have got what a week. I mean,
roller coaster, John. I'm telling you, it's been, and now it's how do we actually reach out to David's relatives who are aged between 77 maybe and into their, David's 88.
His half-brothers and his half-sisters and brothers.
Yeah, sisters and brothers. And I know one of them is 3 years younger than David. So you're talking about somebody who's 85. And how do you approach them? And, I wrote to the Red Cross, who do the tracing and the reaching out. And I wrote to Barnardo's UK. And both replies, or both contact back is that they're working under severe restrictions due to COVID, and they're not actually taking cases right now. So while, I have one way of reaching out because I think I know, and the other way is on Ancestry website. We've updated the family tree, which will show those coming in. I know it's upsetting perhaps, but what's the alternative? David does not find out within his lifetime or been enabled to make that connection. And if it's rejection, it's very, very difficult, but at least we've tried.
Absolutely.
So we're hopeful.
Well, fantastic. That's fantastic news. David is 88.
David's 88 in May and had been born in the Tuam. And his mother, I believe, this is what we think from what we've learned so far, is that Mary was Catholic and her lover was a Protestant. And she called him, she was in love, so she did call him after his dad. He was called David as well. So the family are consoled by that too. And Mary died, we believe, in 1952, but trying to find where we found Mary's grave, because we know that she left Ireland, but we had not any idea prior to that as to where Mary went.
It's very sad. The Protestant, she was clearly in love with them, the father at least.
Yeah, and that she called David. But John, everybody has these stories in our background, and my own connection to Tuam and other Shanross Abbey, and to the Pitumna Workhouse, and to single motherhood begins even before the foundation of the state. Close family connections from 1922 upwards to 1964. So I think families need to be honest, and the secrecy of all of this needs to be unfolded and faced, and courageously faced as well, from the point of view of the survivor or the mother, because governments are the ones withholding, and they are controlling the narrative. And if there's one thing I've learned in the last recent time is that, and I said it to Eunan earlier on, we just had a quick conversation, and I said that we are no nearer justice. I really feel that the cards are stacked against us again, while the government continuously withhold information, or, as I said in Amnesty International when we spoke the other day, what is happening is that the government leak information. At one point they'd been leaking it to Patsy McGarry, the religious affairs correspondent with the Irish Times, and he would inform. And the most recent leak of the Commission's report has never fully been dealt with. That was to be investigated. So we would have expected that the full investigation would be available now, and we would have the results of that, because it did come from within Leinster House to the Sunday Independent.
Eunan, the GDPR rules, I'm not sure whether they applied in your case, finding your mother, but was it her wish at the time that she didn't want to be ever identified when she had, when she gave you up as such?
No, John, that wasn't the case, but the papers that she was forced to sign actually indicated that would be the case. Now, as Frank and Breeda are testimony to so many of the emotional and psychological impacts here, this is real. You're talking about real life intergenerational legacy here. You know what I mean? That's going to permeate down the generations even after ourselves, and affect our immediate families as well, in terms of identity and where you've came from, your origins, your genesis, your heritage, and of course this all includes your medical, biological and genetic history as well. You know what I mean? Which potentially, and a lot of people don't realize this and bring this into the discussion, is that finding your origins can potentially save your life when it comes to anything that might be inherited down your genes. A cancer disease, for example, the BRCA breast cancer gene, all of these sort of things can severely impact your entire life and how it goes forward, and the impact of your children. So what Frank was saying earlier, and what Breeda has alluded to, and what a lot of people in this environment all know about, is, you can see daily on a current basis what's going on in terms of changing legislation and acknowledging coercive control, for example. that's going on domestic situations. And this all is, again, a pervasive fact of the past, present, and future, where you've got duress and coercion. You've got the likes of Stockholm syndrome, which some people would be aware of, and how that affects people, how people then become a complete subject, a complete slave to their institutionalization and the subservience to their master and their controller. And this permeates everything as well. You know, like McAleese, for example, 116 cases of women that he looked at, 58 of those women were actually still in the care of the religious orders. So this is what myself and Breeda, in fact, we're talking about today as well. We've brought up with Frank is, you know, a lot of people affected here going forward of life, you know, started off in an institution and coming near the end of their life in the twilight years can effectively be placed in another institution. So you go from one institution, you might find a bit of time outside, and then you effectively end up in another institution to your damn days. But data protection and the GDPR, all of the issues and the debacle around the repeal of C, for example, that happened before Christmas, has highlighted the massive disparity and the anomalies around all of the issues around gathering information and your entitlement to information. It's obviously highlighted the massive sensitivities between the privacy of a birth mother and the inherent identical rights that are entitled to any adopted person, for example, and even non-adopted people who don't have their information. So it's applies to a lot of people. So what it in fact does, it's actually a very convenient marriage for the government, who are trying to make sure that, and the churches and anybody that are controllers or owners of information, and that when you're trying to do your best to cover up and make secret all of the abuses and crimes associated with that information and that data, then it absolutely suits the governments and the institutions that what's been an entitlement to the privacy of the birth mother suits the perpetrators of the abuses and crimes, because it means that that information, as long as that's protected in that way, then it means that it becomes even more unlikely that all of the crimes and abuses are not going to be exposed through the illegal and the forced adoptions, the extensive trafficking, etc., etc. So this is a marriage of convenience of the government bringing in GDPR, data protection rules, that absolutely suits their regime and their policy and their strategy. And you know, when we have massive issues around when you get your information, if you get any information, for example, it is heavily redacted.
Is it? Yeah.
And it's summarized. So the case of Marion Reynolds, for example, brought this up in that when she delivered her report on the incomplete files around the illegal adoptions, she insisted that she didn't want to put her name to it if the institutions were going to be redacted, which of course happened. And this is the information we face as well. So this brings in all the issues around third-party information that we are told we cannot get full, entitled, original access to our information because there are third parties named in that paperwork.
Right.
So Frank is absolutely right. Breeda knows this. So many of us know this, that the supremacy of GDPR in terms of the European Union has been in so many ways discarded. And it's only been highlighted by so many experts, people like Frank in the background, the likes of Fred Logue and Simon McGarr in the south of Ireland, who, for example, have said, listen, the EU GDPR had supremacy over this national legislation all along, but this has been conveniently used by the governments in both states, whether it's the north or the south, to make sure that the people that are entitled to their information don't get it in completely false circumstances in many ways.
Yeah.
So this is what we need to get to the bottom of, John. This is what needs changed. And we recognise, as an adopted person, I recognise the circumstances in which many of these birth, natural, biological mothers relinquish their children. And of course, the religious institutions, for example, in the Northern Ireland Academic Report, said that, you know, to honour their commitments to the birth mothers, they feel it right that they can't hand over information. So that tells you exactly where they stand. That is so appropriate, you know. And in the meantime, it means that thousands of people like me who have only recently found out they're adopted, thousands of people who will never ever find out they're adopted. That's why, as Breeda's family history has highlighted, why it's so important that we need to take a shortcut and expedite the process with state-funded DNA testing, which must be provided on an urgent basis to anyone who is eligible. And that means anyone affected by these institutions, because it doesn't matter what's handed over, whether it's done through legal compulsion or you give powers to the police to go in and seize records of the institutions, the charities involved, the private individuals like the GPs and the solicitors. Some people will never ever find out their true circumstances, only for DNA testing.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of the situation. You know, this is what impacts everybody's life on a day-to-day basis right now, and will impact people in the next decades down the line.
The TDs who are coming out with that line, you know, these were the wishes of the birth mother at the time. Under the GDPR, who can they be contacted again? Is that maybe Frank can help me on this, or Eunan, in terms of if to understand her wishes today. Would a GDPR or adjudication sort of insist upon something like that? Is that how would it work in practicalities?
I don't think the way that the GDPR and the whole issue has been debated in the Republic, or indeed Northern Ireland, is conducive to that rather sensible approach to matters, because it brings me back to the point I was making earlier about proportionality. So, you know, you have, 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years ago, somebody makes a decision, either voluntarily or under duress or whatever the circumstances are. There is a need, there is a duty, I would say, upon the holder of the data to actually think about that proportionality, to think about the issues which Breeda and Eunan have very eloquently put across, and use that newfound information to seek a balance, to seek a proportional way to deal with the subject access request. At the moment, unfortunately, people are apparently being stonewalled by different organisations, be they state or indeed private organisations. And I've had letters myself, actually, from one religious denomination who sought to lecture me about the GDPR. Seeing the letter, I know how to deal with the letter, but I can imagine that there are many victims and survivors out there, families, who would look at this and think, goodness, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to respond to that? And they're not equipped to do it. And of course, the state and religious orders know perfectly well that that's the case. That's why they hire, expensive lawyers to draft them up what appears to be clever letters in order to stymie something which is not just a legal right, but it is a just legal right, particularly as this whole issue is a matter of important public interest. And I think, sorry to interrupt you, John, but I think the people who are actually managing this are failing to understand their wider public duty to actually find that correct balance. As I said, at the moment, it's simply, oh, well, the mother said no. And that's the end of the story. That isn't the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. Sorry, John.
No. I meant it probably goes both ways in terms of the birth mother trying to discover what happened to her child, isn't it? I mean, it's similar. There's difficulties on both ends, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine, I can speak of it from my point of view, where my trying to get, access to records about, for example, my dad, the amount of pieces of proof that I've had to produce in the first instance. And once I've produced the proof, I then have to prove to some of these organizations and religious orders that I have the correct standing, that I actually have a validity, even though I'm second generation down the line, that I actually have a validity to understand that. And I pick up on a point of that Eunan made there, and I've absolutely used the genetics issue and arguments in letters that I've sent to politicians in the Republic as well as religious orders, because come what may, and we can see it through the vaccine programs. One vaccine is very much a genetic-based vaccine, and I was doing a piece for a television station over in Turkey, and the people before me were part of the biotech company, and they were talking about all the range of genetic medicines that they're about to launch on the market. Now, if you don't understand your own genetics, you may not be able to use those items, or indeed you may be compromised by the use of those items. Or as Eunan says, understanding issues about carcinomas, the thyroid or heart disease and stuff like that. It's all so important. And unfortunately, when it comes to the proportionality point, none of that is considered, or apparently not considered.
Apparently not considered. Breeda?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, the cards are constantly stacked against victim survivor, and any excuse the government can use, they will do so. And in relation to genetics and health and heart conditions and various diseases, we have people within our membership who have those diseases, who do not have and did not have. One was born actually with, it was a disease from the mother, and it has affected the entire life of that person. And the reality is that were he given his details far earlier, he could have had a better response to treatment. So I think it's extremely important that the information, at least the medical information, is provided. But the government should be.
That's a human right, really.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a right to health. Yeah, it's a right to health and an opportunity to live. Yeah.
Yeah, health, that is the really key issue at the moment. There's all sorts of people talking about what should or shouldn't happen in the midst of this crisis. But at its fundamental points, we all have a right to health. And no more important is this true than within the whole Magdalene mother and baby home institutions, industrial schools. It doesn't matter where it is. It's absolutely vital. It's like having a jigsaw, your favorite jigsaw set, and you can't complete the jigsaw because you've got 3 or 4 pieces missing. It's unsatisfying, and it's exactly the same way. It's a simple analogy that I've driven there, but it's exactly the same analogy. This sense of incompleteness, and believe you me, from my family's perspective, we had donkey's years of feeling incomplete. There is still an element of that, but even after all these years, we're still peeling away. Right. The covers that were used in order to keep us from having the knowledge that we have now got, I should say, and that is so against, just on the health issue, that is so against the basic right to health, the basic right to information on your ancestors and the health problems that they have and how that can affect you into the future.
Is there a legal avenue there? I mean, within that, is there a legal avenue to sort of
Yeah, I mean, I've often thought, and I've always been respectful, I hope anyway, to the many campaigners and people that I've met on this journey over the last 11 years. But I do believe that sometimes, from what I'm hearing, what other people are saying to me, and indeed from my own experience, that there are potential routes and opportunities that exist to actually challenge this status quo. And, whether that is through the force of a judicial review, which I think is probably on the data issue, and particularly on the health issue, is probably quite a valid route to take. But I don't know enough about Irish law to know how that could potentially work. But I can actually see, because there's not a big difference between the Irish and the English and Welsh legal systems, to see the potential from that. But I suppose the burgeoning question are, and this is with deep respect to the lawyers that I see out there who seem to be doing a good job, there must be plenty of other Irish lawyers out there who could see this as a cause célèbre. Because it doesn't just open up the possibilities for victims and survivors on the island of Ireland, it opens up all the possibilities for many citizens in different scenarios. And, this kind of route, I mean, we've seen this here in the UK, where judicial review has been deployed ad nauseum in order to challenge governments on a lot of issues. But there seems to be a slight reticence, and I wouldn't put it any stronger than that, in perhaps deploying more imaginative ways, providing pro bono assistance to the victims and survivors.
Yeah, of course.
And protecting them from the potential difficulties of cost. You only need a few lead cases, and to be able to achieve that. But as I say, I'm an English and Welsh qualified lawyer, and it's far be it from me to pontificate about Irish lawyers and the Irish legal system.
We put the word out. Eunan, just finally, news from Northern Ireland this week in terms of any developments?
Not really. There's a truth recovery process, co-design process ongoing. John and I met with the lead panelist just yesterday, in fact, and we discussed a number of issues. We outlined the fact, or I outlined the fact that representative that we don't currently have any access to government, so everything is basically in the hands of mediators between ourselves and government. When we had specifically asked over the last number of months that there are a number of services, redress actions, and all that would need put into place right now. So that's obviously not taking place, but it's a massive concern of ours. Just ongoing, if I could highlight a personal situation of my own, where so many adopted people, for example, in the north, don't know that you can actually go and look at your original court records and your social services records. So I pushed this way back last year. In fact, 2 years ago, I actually applied to the courts to see my adoption consent form, and they allowed me to go and see it. I was allowed to go and see it, but you were hovered and supervised by a court official. You weren't allowed to take photographs. You weren't allowed to photocopy it, so you could take notes on it. And then I pushed to see my entire court file, and I went to see it in Armagh Courthouse just before Christmas, and again under constant supervision the whole time in a massive courtroom on my own. I was allowed to take notes on it, but not allowed to photograph it or take photocopies. And now, mind you, this is my information. So you almost feel like a criminal in a courtroom where, okay, you can have a limited amount of time to look at this here, but you can't photograph it or take it away or get a photocopy of it. And I asked what the criteria was for seeing this, because obviously I applied. It was sent to a judge. He looked at my file, I assume, and he says, yeah, that's okay. Let Eunan come in and look at it. And I asked what the criteria was for that, and there is none.
There's none.
It's completely and utterly discretionary, which is absolutely shocking. And I've applied to have the same done with my social services file. That's a family file on me as a baby. and the circumstances around my birth, and my birth mother, etc., etc. So, as I say, when I first got that 5 years ago, it was heavily redacted and it was summarised, which is absolutely, again, shocking when you think that a social worker appointed by the health trust actually goes in person, looks at your information, interprets it whatever way they want, and then they provide it to you based on how they see your information or what they think you should know.
Right.
And unfortunately, this whole issue of who owns the data, for example, some of the institutions in the north and south that were actually either fully or partly run by the state, we would argue, who owns the data? Who owns the information? The administration files and the personal files of that institution. So is it their managers, in many cases the religious orders, or is it the state? In which case the state should be saying, hold on a minute, we were paying for that child, we were paying for that woman, so just give us the records. We're not asking you, we're taking them.
Yeah.
Can I just cut in and say the owner of the data is the actual subject themselves, because that's exactly what the GDPR tells us. So, you know, irrespective of, you know, this demarcation of, well, we own this or we own that, it's this abstract conversation that's going on, and a discretion, you know, abstract conversations and discretions that are being deployed, which in no way meet any kind of proper proportionality assessments in any legal system. If you look at any legal systems throughout Europe today, it's driven by proportionality. Right. European Court of Human Rights, European Court of Justice, it's all about proportionality. What we've got here, and Eunan has described it brilliantly there, is a complete disjunct between that real need for proportionality against protecting what appears to be vested interests.
Frank, thanks a lot. Thanks for also kind of giving us a good explanation of GDPR and how it affects this situation. Eunan Duffy, thank you very much. Very great to hear you from you tonight. Breeda, anything you wanted to say? I thought you might wanted to get a word in there. Did you, Breeda?
No, just
okay.
Tomorrow is the day for the Oak Consulting for submissions to be in to those. So that's what we're working towards, deadlines this week.
Right. Have you spoken to somebody from Oak Consulting yet?
Oh, we have. We had on the very first day, we had a meeting. There were
of course you did.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Outsourcing testimonies.
Absolutely. Look, there's no need for it, but we are, three of us here jointly are submitting as well, and maybe we'll talk about that next week because we'll be able.
I'd love to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you wanted to talk about it tonight, Breeda, but we will get to it tomorrow or next week, if that's okay.
Next week's lovely. Okay. Thanks a million.
Thanks a lot, Eunan, Breeda, and Frank. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Joe.